hello/x/. After a lot of thinking, and a couple of drinks, I have finally decided to share some of my experiences. English is not my native language, so forgive me if my grammar isn't perfect. Be me. Late 1990s. Work in a very rural area of Russia, as a sort of ranger/wildlife preservationist. In Russia we don't have the same regulations and strict protocol as some of you might. We more or less just drive around ATVs and berate poachers, while we ensure the safety of the deer population and stuff like that. I worked in a rural area, surround-fed by forests and harsh wilderness. Only had one colleague, who we'll call Pietr. Pietr was your typical backwash crazy Russian dude, who brewed his own vodka and smoked like a chimney. He was my best friend for several years, and always had my back, no matter what faced us in the woods. The job had horrendous pay, but it came with loads of perks that made it worth it. We had no boss and could basically just go camping, get wasted, and call it an excursion. I will admit that we once or twice hustled some innocent hunters for their money by claiming they were poaching. We were corrupt as heck, but still managed to make some decent arrests and put some real poachers behind bars. But sometimes we got calls that required us to do some actual hard work. If people spotted sick animals, it fell upon us to go out there and make sure it didn't spread. If an animal showed aggressive behavior that might endanger locals, we had to ensure that the animal got put down. We had friends at the local vet who would run blood samples if we suspected rabies or something else. One day Pietr and I got a call from some pretty spooked locals. They told us that some boys had gone hunting a couple days ago, but none of them had returned. They all believed that they had been killed by bears or wolves. Great. Now we have to venture into the wilderness for some potentially aggressive carnivores. They point us in the direction, and we take off on our ATVs. We drive around the area for about 3 hours, when we find an abandoned campsite. It was evident the camp had been trashed by something, probably a bear. By the looks of it, the boys had left the campsite in a hurry, not even bringing their rifles. From then on we went on foot, with our guns drawn, just in case. We found the first corpse a few meters away from their camp. He was lying on his stomach, with severely deep wounds in his back. What struck us as weird, was that it was all the same deep puncture wounds, which we had never before seen in a bear or wolf attack. There was a clear path, which indicated the other boys had fled. We found 2 boys in the same small area, both of them lying dead with similar wounds. One of them had been practically gutted. Pietr was visibly shaken by the scene, and just kept shaking his head in disbelief. According to the locals, there was supposed to be 4 guys out here, so we were still missing one. We both tactically crapped our pants when we heard something rustling through the brush towards us. We aimed at the commotion and waited for it to reveal itself before we shot. I almost dropped my rifle when it emerged from the dense bushes. It was a red stag, with the mangled remains of the 4th boy stuck in his antlers. It had trouble holding its balance under the weight of the boy, but it still bellowed aggressively, as if it was going to charge us. Pietr was the first to snap out of the shock, and started lighting the frickin' thing up. Upon further inspection we noticed that its antlers were worn down and broken. It had put an excessive amount of force behind each of its charges, breaking its antlers on the poor boys. The reason the 4th boy was stuck in the antlers, was because the dang thing had practically torn through his rib cage. We couldn't separate the boy from the antlers, so we had to bring the head with us. It was one of the most frickin' up rides home, with the cargo of several dead corpses tied to the back of our ATVs. The local authorities were pretty angry at us, seeing as we had moved bodies from a potential crime scene, but let us off easy, seeing as the killer was literally embedded into the victims. Seeing the heartbroken parents of these boys still haunts me. That night I hung out with Pietr, mostly because I was still pretty spooked. That crap wasn't natural, he had said at one point. Deer can be aggressive and defend against predators, yes. But this fracker hunted down those boys and killed them all. They don't just do that. That was the first time I caught a glimpse of the spooky stuff that goes on out there. In the following years I saw some insanely messed up things, that only Pietr and I know about. I will share stories with you, and hopefully you will believe me and understand why I am scared speechless every time I see a deer. About once or twice a month, we had to go on excursions into the wilderness to look for signs of poachers, sick animals, or other stuff like that. One time we decided to drive out to a fairly secluded area, because there were rumors of some potential poaching. It was a very long drive, so we had always put it off, praying that the poachers would just get mauled by bears so that we didn't have to make the long journey. We had to drive about 15 hours before the terrain became too difficult for the ATVs to handle. We had to walk the rest of the way, which meant we had to camp out. I was pretty uneasy when night came. Camping out is a norm for us, but we were further away from civilization than we had been before, and the previous incident still haunted my mind. Pietr offered me a bottle to ease my worries, but I didn't want to be intoxicated in case we were attacked by some demonic deer. The night went by without incident, but I still didn't get a lot of sleep. We continued our trek toward the supposed poacher hotspot. We arrived, looked around, but found nothing. There didn't seem to be any sign of human activity anywhere in this area. Fudging rumors, Pietr mumbled to himself as he shook his head in frustration. Normally we should have been happy finding nothing, but this time we were just exhausted and cranky. We were then startled by a loud bellow that echoed through the forest. What the heck was that? Pietr pulled out his rifle and aimed in the direction of the noise. Though it went against our instincts, we had to investigate it. We reached a small ridge that overlooked the clearing. In the middle of the clearing, a group of 5 stags huddled together. Their heads were bowed down as if they were grazing. We noticed they all seemed to make sudden violent jerking motions, like they were trying to gore the ground with their antlers. Pietr fired a shot into the air to try making them scatter. They didn't freaking move. If you have any basic knowledge on wildlife, you know that sudden loud noises make just about any animal take off running. We fired a couple more shots into the air, but they still didn't react. In a small moment of madness, we decided to calmly approach them, to get a better look at what they were hecking doing. As we approached them, we were met with the nasty stench of rot and crap. Is that a freaking bear? Pietr gestured to the ground in front of the stags. To our collective bewilderment, there was a large adult brown bear. It was in a stage of decomposition, which meant it had been dead for at least 4 or 5 days. The stags were panting and groaning as they continuously gored the carcass over and over again. They looked seriously malnourished and exhausted. The bear's body was completely ripped apart, except for the head, which they for some reason kept completely unscathed. We stood, frozen to the ground, as we watched the horrible scene unfold. How did they take down a bear? How the actual frick is that possible? I asked Pietr. He shook his head in disbelief as he raised his rifle and shot one of the stags. He later explained he wanted a blood sample. As soon as the stag fell to the ground, the others stopped what they were doing and just turned to look at us. They were covered in rotting blood and chunks of meat. They didn't charge or show any aggressive behavior. They just stare at us, unflinching and unblinking. Piotr changed his mind about the blood sample at this point and just started backing away slowly. I followed suit and raised my rifle just in case. When we reached the ridge, they resumed their mauling, once again not paying attention to us. We were freaking done at this point. We didn't set up camp that night and just kept hiking at a brisk pace until we reached our ATVs. Neither of us spoke a word the entire ride home, except for the occasional "oh heck." That incident really messed something up in Piotr. It took him a couple of weeks before he went with me to the forest again. He was completely convinced that the stags were being manipulated by a witch or something, which I'm really not sure of. I don't really believe in witches and all that, I just believe that nature is a lot more freaky than we believe. We have been away from real, raw nature for so long because we chose to live in cities, that we have likely forgotten how scary and unpredictable it can be. Still, there was something off about those stags. Still don't have an explanation. One day we got a call from the local authorities. Apparently some old man that lived by himself in a remote cabin had not been seen in a while. They wanted us to take them to the cabin, since they weren't used to terrain other than paved streets. We drove them to the cabin and parked a few meters from the front door. It was already clear that something had happened. The door was completely knocked off its hinges. Cabin was empty. The officers asked us to assist them in their search. We agreed. The initial theory was that he had been taken away by a bear, which seemed pretty plausible considering the frickin' up door. We spread out and followed whatever trails we could find. It took about half an hour before one of the officers called something in. He sounded a little shaken, but gave us detailed directions to where he was. He didn't tell us what he had found, but instead said, "You'll want to see this yourselves." When we reached him, it wasn't clear what he had found since nothing looked out of place. No broken branches, no trail, no nothing. He just pointed up into a large tree in front of him. Slung over one of the higher branches was a fresh deer carcass. This was certainly odd, but we still didn't get what this had to do with the case. Then we noticed something even stranger. Further up the tree was a bear carcass. Something had killed a bear, then placed it in the tree. I knew that leopards and other big cats did that for later consumption. But there are no leopards or tigers where this took place. The officers looked uneasy, and took glances over their shoulders. We stayed as a group after that, and looked around for a couple more hours before we called it. On our way back, we once again passed the tree. The deer was gone, only leaving some bloody branches behind. We picked up the pace and made our way out of there without looking back. There was a winter where we had a pretty horrible incident. As you would probably expect, the winters can be pretty rough, with an actual ton of snow and minus 40 degrees Celsius, which is also minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. If someone goes missing, they are immediately presumed dead, because it's impossible to maintain your core temperature for long durations, without being properly equipped. And when somebody's child goes missing, it's the absolute worst. The police once again requested our assistance, because a mother had reported her 6-year-old daughter missing. The thought of spending hours in the biting cold was not welcoming, but we couldn't possibly turn a blind eye to a missing child. The mother had let her children play outside when one of them started running into the tree line. That's when they called the police, who then called us. By the time we arrived at the research area, she had been missing for about 2 hours. We followed a trail that we suspected was hers. It went on for way longer than what a child that age should be able to run. Then it just stopped. There was no sidestepping, or any sign of, well, anything. It was like she had just vanished on the spot. We examined the tracks, to see if she had backtracked or something, but there was no clear sign of any double prints. Pietr was visibly upset and frustrated. We asked the other kids why she started running into the forest. They had no clear answer but claimed that she just started running away without any warning. The kids were shaking and crying, so we asked the mother to return with them to their home while we kept looking. An officer followed them back to their house so that they felt safer. About 15 minutes later, one of the officers got a call on their walkie-talkie. We could hear the distinct sounds of the mother wailing in the background. They had found the girl.
In which part of Russia were you, OP?
Yakutia. They had found her just sitting on the step to the back door. She was dead and almost frozen solid. She had only worn a regular jacket and pants, considering she was only supposed to be outside for a little while. The mother had locked the doors before they left, because she didn't want her house to get robbed while they were away. To this day I tear up when I think about it. But I still have some unanswered questions as to what had happened. The obvious solution is that she had returned home and froze to death when she couldn't get in. But I think there's still more to it. If she had run back, how did none of her siblings notice her? Why didn't she respond to their calls? How did she run back without leaving any tracks? How was she almost frozen solid, even though she was only missing for a few hours? None of the neighbors had seen anything unusual, so there was nothing to investigate. The mother blamed herself and became an alcoholic. I still think about that incident every day. For some reason it hit harder than the 4 boys who had been mauled.
There are 2 more parts to this story loaded onto the drive here. If you want to listen to them, then leave me a comment. Oh, hold on, there is an interestingly named file here. Let me just... Well, that was interesting. I better run before the... Welp.
Self-destruct sequence activated.